Red light flooded the cockpit before Kale Reyes even finished strapping into his seat. A warning tone screamed through the cramped cabin, sharp and unrelenting, bouncing off metal walls that had seen better decades. "Reactor core at 40% stability," said the ship's voice, flat and unbothered, as if it announced this every day. Which honestly, it did. Kale slammed his palm against the console, silencing the alarm just long enough to think. Sweat had already gathered at his temple, though he had been on this ship for less than 10 minutes. This was supposed to be simple, a short flight, a test, nothing that should have made his hands shake like this. He looked around the cockpit of the vessel he had been assigned only an hour earlier. Wires hung loose near his feet. One display flickered every few seconds like it could not decide whether to work. The seat beneath him creaked whenever he shifted his weight. This was the ship they gave him. Out of everything in the Academy's docking bay, this rusted, groaning hull was what Cadet Kale Reyes received on graduation day. He was the only human in his class. Every other cadet walking those metal corridors belonged to species that had been part of galactic society for generations. Tall, calm, confident beings who barely looked at him when they passed. Humanity was new here. New and not yet trusted. An instructor named Vesic, a tall alien with pale blue skin and unreadable eyes, had handed him his assignment that morning without any pretense of kindness. This vessel, Vesic had said, tapping a data pad, was scheduled for scrap, since Command insists every cadet must complete a solo flight before certification. You will take it instead. Kale had wanted to argue. He had wanted to point out that every other cadet received a fully functioning training ship, freshly serviced, with weapons that worked and engines that did not sound like they were coughing up metal shavings. But arguing would only prove what half the instructors already believed, that humans complained instead of adapting. So instead, he had said nothing. He had taken the assignment, walked to the docking bay, and stared up at the ship now shaking gently around him. It looked less like a starship and more like something someone had assembled from spare parts found in a junkyard. Because that was essentially true. "You're not going to embarrass me," he muttered to the ship, running a hand along the edge of the console. "We're going to do this flight, and we're going to do it clean." The engines groaned in response, which he chose to take as agreement. His assignment was simple enough on paper: fly to a dead system 3 light-years away, collect a data buoy that had stopped transmitting months earlier, and return. No combat, no complications. A task so basic that most cadets completed it without incident within a day. Kale eased the ship out of the docking bay, guiding it past sleek, polished vessels belonging to other graduates. A group of alien cadets stood near the viewing deck, watching him leave. He caught sight of their expressions through the viewport. Amusement, pity, a little bit of curiosity, as if wondering how long it would take before the wreck failed completely. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the console in front of him. Every human back on Earth's early colonies knew this feeling. The quiet certainty that people were waiting for you to fail, and the stubborn refusal to give them the satisfaction. The ship shuddered as it cleared the station's gravity well, joining the open black of space. For a moment, everything felt strangely peaceful. No sirens, no warning lights, just stars stretching out ahead of him, endless and silent. That peace lasted 17 minutes. The first sign of trouble came from the navigation display, which blinked once, then displayed a route that made no sense. Kale frowned, tapping the screen, expecting a simple glitch. Instead, the numbers shifted again, pulling coordinates from somewhere that should not have existed in his flight plan. "That's not right," he said aloud, more to himself than to the ship. He pulled up the system logs, trying to trace the error, but before he could isolate it, the entire display flickered and reset itself. The engines responded to the new heading immediately, adjusting the ship's course without his input. Kale grabbed the manual controls, trying to override the shift, but the response lagged behind his commands by several long seconds. The ship was correcting itself back onto the old, false trajectory each time. "Come on," he muttered, fighting the controls. "Not now. Any time but now." He had heard the rumors about this class of ship. Old models like this sometimes carried corrupted navigation cores, remnants of outdated software nobody had bothered updating before decommissioning them. He had assumed the rumors were exaggerated. Now he was not so sure. Cale forced himself to breathe slowly, the way instructors had taught him during simulation drills. Panic solved nothing. He needed information first. He pulled up a star chart, cross-referencing his current position against the corrupted coordinates the ship insisted on following. What he found made his stomach tighten. The new heading was steering him away from the dead system entirely, deep into unclaimed space near the edges of a border region most star charts marked only with a vague warning. Unmonitored territory, the kind of space patrol ships avoided, not because of monsters or myths, but because of who claimed unofficial ownership over it. The Threll Dominion. Cale had heard about them only in passing lectures back at the Academy. An expansionist alien power, cautious and calculated, currently maintaining an uneasy peace with the wider galactic community. Nobody wanted to provoke them. Nobody flew this close to their territory without authorization. And now his malfunctioning navigation system was dragging him straight toward it. "Override," he said firmly, punching in manual commands. "Return to designated flight path." The console blinked in acknowledgement, then reverted right back to the corrupted heading within seconds. Something deeper than a simple software glitch was happening here, though he had no time to investigate the cause. Whatever was wrong with this ship, it wanted to take him somewhere he was never supposed to go. He tried the comms next, intending to report the malfunction and request a return escort. Static answered him. Not silence, which might have suggested a simple range issue, but genuine interference, the kind caused by deliberate jamming. Cale's pulse quickened. He forced himself to think clearly. If the ship would not obey standard commands, perhaps he could work with its quirks instead of against them. He pulled up the engine diagnostics, searching for any manual valve or system he could adjust by hand rather than through software. His fingers found a physical override switch tucked beneath the main console, something clearly installed decades ago before automated systems became standard. He flipped it, cutting power briefly to the navigation computer. The screens went dark. For 3 heartbeats, there was nothing but the low hum of idle engines and Cale's own uneven breathing. Then the lights flickered back on, and the navigation display returned, this time blank, waiting for fresh input rather than following its previous corrupted instructions. "Yes," Cale breathed, relief washing briefly through him. He immediately began entering the correct coordinates back toward his assigned system, fingers moving quickly across the console. That was when the proximity sensor chimed. Cale's head snapped up toward the viewport. Far in the distance, barely visible against the darkness, a shape was moving. Angular, sharp-edged, unlike anything built by any species he recognized from Academy recognition charts. A listening post, likely automated, but clearly active and clearly aware of his presence now that his ship had drifted this deep into forbidden space. A second chime followed the first, then a third, each one closer together, each one more urgent. Something out there had noticed him. Cale's hands hovered over the controls, torn between finishing the correction back to his original flight path and preparing for whatever was about to happen. He had no weapons worth mentioning. He had a ship barely capable of holding itself together. And he had wandered, through no real fault of his own, straight into territory belonging to a power everyone back home had been carefully avoiding. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice steady, even though nobody else was listening. "Okay," he said quietly. "New plan." The listening post's angular silhouette grew larger against the stars, no longer distant, no longer ignorable. Whatever came next, Cale understood one thing with total clarity. This was not a simple training flight anymore, and there would be no quiet, unnoticed return home. The listening post's lights blinked once, then twice, a slow, deliberate rhythm that Cale recognized immediately from Academy lectures on unfamiliar contact protocols. It had seen him. Whatever automated system controlled that station was now transmitting his position to someone, somewhere, and there was nothing subtle about it anymore. "Think," he told himself, gripping the edge of the console. "Think, don't panic." He pulled up what little sensor data the ship could gather, watching the listening post's outlines sharpen with distance closing. It was small, likely unmanned, built to monitor rather than engage directly. That gave him a narrow window. If he moved quickly enough, he might slip past its effective range before whoever monitored its signals could respond. Cale eased the throttle forward, angling the ship away from the station in a wide arc rather than a straight retreat. Straight lines were predictable. Predictable was dangerous. The engines groaned in protest, vibrations rattling through the frame hard enough that he felt them in his teeth. He glanced at the reactor display, watching stability numbers flicker between acceptable and concerning. This ship had been built for routine flights, not evasive maneuvers, and it was making that limitation very clear. "Just a little further," he muttered, watching the listening post shrink slightly on his display. "Just get us clear, and then we go home," and none of this ever happened. That hope lasted less than a minute. A new blip appeared on the sensor readout, larger than the listening post, moving with purpose rather than simply monitoring. Then a second blip joined it, then a third. Cale's stomach dropped as he realized what he was looking at. These were not automated defenses reacting blindly. These were ships, real, crude vessels, changing course to intercept him with the kind of coordinated movement that suggested actual pilots at the controls, not simple programmed responses. The Threll Dominion did not send single scouts to investigate border intrusions. They sent formations. "Okay," Cale said, forcing his voice to stay level, despite the way his hands had started to tremble slightly against the controls. "Okay, this is bad. This is very bad." He pulled every scrap of speed he could manage from the aging engines, watching numbers climb slowly, too slowly, while the pursuing ships gained ground with unsettling efficiency. His vessel had never been built for a chase. It had been built to survive one short training flight and then quietly retire into scrap metal. The comm system flickered, catching a fragment of transmission this time instead of pure static. A voice, sharp and clipped, spoke words Cale did not understand, though the tone required no translation. It was a warning, possibly a demand to halt, possibly something far less polite. He did not stop to find out. Cale banked hard, sending the ship into a tight turn that sent loose tools skittering across the cabin floor. Metal groaned around him, the hull protesting the sudden shift in direction, but the maneuver bought him a few precious seconds as the pursuing ships adjusted their own trajectories to compensate. "Come on," he breathed, eyes darting between the sensor display and the viewport ahead. "Come on, come on." A shudder ran through the ship as something struck the outer hull, not a direct hit, but close enough that alarms immediately flared to life across the console. Cale's heart slammed against his ribs as he checked the damage readout. A glancing shot along the rear stabilizer, nothing critical yet, but a clear message. These pilots were not simply trying to force him to stop anymore. They intended to end this quickly. He needed options, and he needed them now. His mind raced through academy training, searching for anything useful buried among lessons designed for controlled simulations rather than genuine danger. Standard evasive patterns would not work against pilots this coordinated. Standard distress signals would take too long to reach anyone capable of helping him. He needed something unconventional, something these pursuers would not expect from a supposedly harmless training vessel. His eyes landed on the reactor display again, still flickering between acceptable and concerning stability levels. An idea began forming, reckless and uncertain, but it was the only card he had left to play. Cale reached for the engineering controls, fingers moving quickly as he began redirecting power away from non-essential systems and funneling it toward the reactor's containment field instead. If he pushed the unstable core just past its safety threshold, briefly, carefully, it would release a surge of radiation and plasma discharge through the ship's rear vents. Not enough to damage his own systems permanently, but more than enough to scramble sensor readings on anything following closely behind him. "This is either going to save us," he said through gritted teeth, adjusting the containment field manually, or it's going to end very badly. He held his breath and triggered the release. The ship lurched violently as plasma vented from the rear stabilizers in a bright, chaotic burst. Cale's vision blurred momentarily from the sudden shift in gravity compensation. His body pressed hard against the restraints as the vessel shuddered from the discharge. Behind him, sensor readouts showed exactly what he had hoped for. The pursuing ship's targeting systems flickered, confused by the sudden radiation bloom now trailing behind his vessel like a chaotic smokescreen. Their formation broke apart slightly as pilots adjusted, momentarily unable to get a clean lock through the interference. "Yes," Cale breathed, allowing himself half a second of relief before refocusing on the controls. "Yes, come on, work with me here." He used the brief confusion to alter course sharply, angling away from the interference cloud, rather than through it, buying himself distance while the enemy ships struggled to reacquire a clear track. The reactor display flashed a warning about the strain he had just placed on already fragile systems, but for now, it held. The respite was brief. Within moments, the pursuing formation adjusted, splitting into two groups. One continued charting a path through the lingering plasma cloud, sensors compensating for the interference. The other peeled away, curving wide in an attempt to cut off his likely escape route rather than simply chasing directly behind him. Cale's pulse spiked as he recognized the maneuver. These were not simple, aggressive pilots relying on raw speed. Someone commanding that formation understood tactics, understood how to box in a fleeing target rather than just run it down. That kind of composed, patient hostility was far more dangerous than a simple, angry pursuit would have been. "They're not just chasing me," he murmured, watching the two groups adjust their approach vectors on his display. "They're hurting me." He needed to break their expectations, and quickly, before that pincer closed into something he could not escape. Cale pulled up a rough star chart of the surrounding region, searching for anything that might disrupt their coordinated approach. A debris field lingered nearby, remnants of some ancient collision long forgotten by galactic records, scattered rock and metal drifting in slow, silent orbits. Dangerous under normal circumstances, potentially useful under these ones. He angled the ship directly toward the debris field, ignoring every academy lesson about avoiding unnecessary hazards during active pursuit. Predictable pilots avoided danger. Unpredictable pilots sometimes survived by embracing it instead. The ship rattled hard as he weaved between the first scattered fragments, hull scraping dangerously close to jagged edges of broken rock. Warning alerts flared continuously now, a chorus of red lights demanding his attention from every direction, but Cale forced himself to focus solely on the shifting obstacles ahead. Behind him, the pursuing formation hesitated at the edge of the debris field, several ships slowing their approach rather than risking the same reckless path. Only one vessel continued the chase directly, smaller and faster than the others, clearly piloted by someone either exceptionally skilled or exceptionally reckless themselves. Cale gritted his teeth, guiding his ship through a narrow gap between two large fragments, close enough that he heard metal scrape audibly against the hull plating. The pursuing vessel matched the maneuver almost perfectly, closing distance with unsettling precision. "Fine," Cale said, adrenaline burning away the last traces of fear from his voice, replaced instead by sharp, focused determination. "Let's see how good you really are." He cut power briefly to his forward thrusters, allowing momentum alone to carry him through a tighter gap ahead, one that would force the pursuing pilot to either match his exact trajectory or peel away entirely. It was a gamble, the kind of maneuver that could easily end with his ship torn apart against unmoving rock, rather than surviving through to the other side. For one suspended moment, everything went quiet, except for the low groan of strained metal and his own racing heartbeat. Then his ship burst through the gap, hull intact, systems screaming warnings but still functional. Behind him, the pursuing vessel clipped a fragment of debris along its wing, sending it spinning off course, forced to break away from the chase entirely to stabilize. Cale allowed himself a single, sharp breath of relief. It did not last. New contacts bloomed across his sensor display, more numerous than before, converging from a different vector entirely. This was not simply a patrol responding to an intrusion anymore. This was a larger formation, organized and purposeful, moving with the kind of coordination that suggested something far bigger than a routine border skirmish. Cale's blood ran cold as he studied the numbers. Whatever chatter existed between these ships, whatever brief fragments of transmission his ship's outdated systems managed to intercept over the following minutes, one thing became increasingly, terribly clear. This was not just a scattered defensive response to his accidental intrusion. This was a fleet. And fleets like this did not exist simply to guard empty listening posts. Somewhere ahead of him, hidden among the noise of engines and static and warning alarms, Cale began to understand that he had stumbled onto something far larger and far more dangerous than a simple navigation malfunction. And there was no way to unlearn what he now suspected. He was not just running for his own survival anymore. The chatter came through in broken fragments at first, half words swallowed by static. But Cale's translator implant slowly began piecing together enough to understand the shape of what he was hearing. Coordinates, formation numbers, references to a garrison world Cale vaguely recalled from Academy star charts. A neutral system allied loosely with several member species of the wider galactic community. His stomach twisted as the pieces fell into place. This was not border security responding to a lost cadet. This was a forward scouting fleet, probing weaknesses along a route that led directly toward an allied world, one that almost certainly had no idea an entire hostile formation was quietly gathering just beyond its detection range. "They're not looking for me," Cale whispered, understanding dawning cold and sharp in his chest. "I just got in the way." That realization changed everything. He could still attempt to simply survive, to slip away and vanish back toward friendly space, reporting the encounter once he reached somewhere safe. But every extra minute this fleet spent chasing him was a minute they were not spending finalizing their approach toward that garrison world, and if he escaped cleanly now, quietly, they would simply resume their original plan the moment he was gone. Cale's hands tightened on the controls. "Okay," he said, voice steadying, despite the fear still coursing through him. New plan. Again. He needed to do more than escape. He needed to disrupt them, delay them, buy enough time for that unaware world to receive some kind of warning before this fleet arrived in force. And he needed to do it with a ship barely holding itself together, no functional weapons to speak of, and pursuers who had already demonstrated they were neither careless nor easily fooled. He forced his breathing to slow, falling back on the only advantage he suspected he still held. These pilots, disciplined and coordinated as they were, had trained against threats that behaved in predictable, logical ways. Cale had spent his entire life around instructors who viewed humans as reckless, precisely because human tactics rarely followed clean, expected patterns. Maybe reckless was exactly what this moment required. He pulled up the star charts again, searching further along his projected escape route. There, marked faintly on outdated survey data, likely last updated decades earlier, lay an asteroid corridor threading between two dead moons. Dense, hazardous, largely unmapped in modern detail, but familiar to Cale from an obscure historical survey he had once studied purely out of curiosity during a slow week at the Academy. If he could lead this fleet through that corridor, using terrain to slow their formation, he might buy enough time for a warning signal to reach the garrison world ahead of them. It was a fragile plan built on old data and desperate hope, but it was something. Cale altered course, angling toward the corridor while simultaneously working the comm system, trying to punch a distress signal through the jamming interference surrounding him. Most of his attempts dissolved into static, swallowed before they could travel any meaningful distance. But buried in old training manuals was a mention of subspace beacon frequencies, older protocols largely abandoned by modern militaries in favor of newer systems, frequencies unlikely to be actively monitored or jammed by this particular fleet. His fingers moved quickly, activating an emergency subspace beacon buried deep in the ship's outdated systems, broadcasting a garbled but persistent signal indicating an intrusion along this border region. He had no way of knowing if anyone would receive it in time, or if they would dismiss it entirely as another minor human malfunction, the same way so many of his instructors dismissed nearly everything associated with his species. But it was sent now. There was nothing left to do but continue forward and hope. The pursuing formation adjusted course behind him as he entered the asteroid corridor, several smaller vessels breaking away from the main group to follow directly, while the larger ships hung back, clearly wary of the dense obstacle field ahead. Kale guided his ship deeper into the drifting rock, weaving between massive fragments with a mixture of memorized survey data and pure improvisation. The engines groaned continuously now, protesting every sharp turn, every sudden burst of speed. He ignored the growing list of warning alerts, focusing entirely on staying just ahead of the pursuing vessels, while leading them further along the corridor's twisting path. One of the smaller pursuing ships clipped a drifting fragment, spinning off course briefly before correcting. Another matched his movements with unsettling precision, clearly piloted by someone skilled enough to keep pace despite the hazardous terrain. Kale risked a glance at his sensor display and felt his chest tighten. That particular ship was gaining on him. He needed another disruption, another unexpected move these disciplined pilots would not anticipate. His mind raced back to the plasma venting trick from earlier, already used once, and likely anticipated now if he attempted the exact same maneuver again. He needed something different. His eyes landed on the cargo manifest display, listing the meager supplies loaded for his original simple mission, standard equipment, spare parts, and several canisters of coolant meant for reactor maintenance, currently unused since the reactor's issues stemmed from containment field instability rather than temperature regulation. An idea sparked, reckless but potentially useful. Kale rerouted a portion of ship power toward the rear cargo bay, manually triggering an emergency release mechanism for several coolant canisters, timing it precisely as the pursuing vessel closed distance behind him through a narrow gap in the asteroid field. The canisters ejected directly into the pursuing ship's path, tumbling end over end through open space. Coolant was not explosive, not directly dangerous in the way a weapon might be, but colliding with dense metal canisters at high speed while navigating tight quarters was more than enough to force any competent pilot into evasive action. The pursuing vessel banked sharply, narrowly avoiding a direct collision, momentum carrying it dangerously close to a nearby asteroid fragment instead. Kale watched on his display as the ship clipped the rock hard enough to send it tumbling briefly out of formation, losing precious distance while it stabilized. "Sorry," Kale muttered, though he did not slow down long enough to see the aftermath clearly. "Not sorry, actually." He pushed forward through the remainder of the corridor, watching his sensor readout carefully as the main pursuing formation struggled to maintain a coordinated approach through the hazardous terrain. Several ships had fallen back entirely, unwilling to risk further damage navigating blind through dense asteroid fields chasing a single, seemingly insignificant scout vessel. But not all of them fell back. The largest ship in the formation, a vessel clearly serving as some kind of command or flagship, based on its size and the deference other vessels showed toward its movements, continued forward, with steady, unhurried confidence. It did not weave desperately through the corridor the way smaller ships did. It simply pushed through obstacles with brute durability, clearly built to withstand exactly this kind of hazardous terrain without concern. Kale's stomach sank as he realized outrunning that particular ship through raw evasive maneuvering alone was unlikely to work indefinitely. It was larger, sturdier, and patient in a way that suggested its commander understood exactly how this chase would eventually end if nothing changed. He needed to reach the far end of the corridor, and whatever lay beyond it, hopefully closer to friendly space, before that flagship closed the remaining distance. The ship shuddered violently as he pushed the engines harder, ignoring the reactor's increasingly frantic warnings about stability. Sparks flew briefly from a damaged conduit near his feet, filling the cabin with a sharp burning smell that made his eyes water slightly. he forced himself to ignore it, hands steady on the controls despite everything happening around him. Ahead, the corridor began to open into wider space, dead moons falling away behind him as the asteroid field thinned into scattered, less dangerous debris. Beyond that, according to his outdated charts, lay the border region separating unclaimed space from territory patrolled more actively by Allied forces. If he could just reach that border, there was a chance, however small, that someone might already be responding to the distress beacon he had triggered earlier. The flagship emerged from the thinning asteroid field behind him, gaining speed now that open space allowed it to move without restriction. Cale watched the distance between them shrink steadily on his sensor display, each passing second bringing that massive vessel closer to a range where its weapons, whatever they were, would become a genuine and immediate threat rather than a distant concern. "Almost there," Cale said through gritted teeth, watching the border marker on his star chart draw steadily closer. "Almost there, come on." A warning chime sounded, sharp and sudden, different from the steady chorus of alerts he had grown almost used to over the past hour. He glanced down and felt his chest tighten further. The flagship had opened a weapons lock. Cale's hands moved instinctively, throwing the ship into another sharp evasive turn, buying himself another few precious seconds while the larger vessel adjusted its aim. He understood, with sudden clarity, that raw evasive tactics alone would not save him indefinitely against a ship this size, this capable, and this patient. He needed help, and he needed it to arrive soon, or this desperate gamble he had built from outdated star charts, aging equipment, and stubborn determination would end here, quietly, in a stretch of unclaimed space nobody back home would even know to search. The border marker blinked steadily closer on his display, tantalizingly near, yet still frustratingly distant, given the growing threat closing in from behind. Cale pushed the engines to their absolute limit, ignoring every warning light now flooding his console in a chaotic wash of red, focused entirely on reaching that invisible line before the flagship's weapons found their mark. The weapons lock warning blared steadily now, an insistent tone Cale could no longer ignore no matter how tightly he focused on evasive maneuvers. He threw the ship into another sharp turn, feeling the frame groan under the strain, buying himself precious seconds while the flagship adjusted its aim once again. He was close to the border now, close enough that his outdated star chart showed the invisible line separating unclaimed space from actively patrolled Allied territory just ahead. But close was not the same as safe, and every evasive maneuver bought only fleeting moments rather than genuine escape. Cale's mind raced, searching desperately for any advantage he had not yet used. He thought back to half-remembered history lessons from his childhood on Earth, lessons alien instructors at the Academy had dismissed as irrelevant ancient conflicts with no bearing on modern galactic warfare. Guerrilla tactics, misdirection, the idea that a smaller, weaker force could still shape the outcome of a larger conflict, not through raw strength, but through forcing an enemy to fight on terms they never expected. His pursuers expected him to simply run, to flee toward safety as quickly and directly as possible. That predictability was exactly what the flagship's patient, steady pursuit was built to counter. So Cale did something different. Instead of angling directly toward the border, he adjusted course slightly, appearing to veer off track, as though panic or damaged systems were forcing him away from the most direct escape route. It looked, to any observer, like the desperate stumbling of a pilot losing control rather than a deliberate choice. The flagship adjusted its own trajectory to compensate, confident in closing the remaining distance during what appeared to be his moment of weakness. That confidence was exactly what Cale needed. His altered path was not random. It followed a specific route he had memorized from the outdated survey charts hours earlier, one that threaded directly through a region marked with faint warnings about old, largely forgotten minefields, remnants from some long-past regional dispute nobody had bothered fully clearing afterward. Modern sensors on most vessels would easily detect and avoid such hazards. Modern sensors on this ship, however, had been quietly disabled by Cale himself several minutes earlier, redirecting their limited remaining power toward propulsion instead. If his own systems could not detect the mines clearly, there was a reasonable chance the pursuing flagship, moving fast and confident, might not register the danger in time either. It was an enormous gamble. If his memory of the old charts proved wrong, if the mines had shifted or degraded over the years into uselessness, this entire desperate plan would collapse into nothing more than a lucky escape rather than any real victory. Cale guided his ship carefully along the very edge of the marked minefield, staying just outside the most concentrated area while ensuring his path remained convincingly erratic to anyone watching from behind. The flagship followed. For a moment, nothing happened. Cale's heart pounded painfully hard against his ribs as seconds stretched by in tense silence, broken only by the persistent hum of overworked engines and his own ragged breathing. Then the first explosion lit up his rear sensor display, bright and sudden, followed almost immediately by a second. The flagship shuddered visibly even from this distance, its trajectory faltering as it struck the edge of the old minefield directly. Cale watched, breath caught in his throat, as the massive vessel's shields flared brightly under the impact, absorbing much of the damage but clearly losing speed and cohesion in its pursuit. It did not stop entirely. It did not explode into pieces the way dramatic stories might suggest. But it slowed, damaged enough that its pilots were forced to divert attention toward internal systems rather than continuing an aggressive chase. Cale allowed himself a single, sharp exhale of relief, though he did not slow his own ship's pace even slightly. This was not the moment to relax. This was the moment to press whatever advantage he had just gained. He pushed forward, finally angling directly toward the border marker now visible clearly on his display, no longer bothering to disguise his intended path since the flagship's momentum had already been broken. New signals bloomed suddenly across his sensor readout, different from the hostile formation behind him, larger, more numerous, moving with the coordinated precision of a properly organized response rather than a scattered pursuit. Cale's breath caught as he recognized the signatures. Allied ships. His desperate, half-hopeful distress beacon triggered hours earlier through outdated subspace frequencies had actually reached someone. And that someone had responded, not with a single vessel, but with what appeared to be a proper defensive formation, moving swiftly toward the border region to intercept whatever threat had triggered the alert. Relief flooded through him so intensely that his hands trembled slightly against the controls, though he forced himself to stay focused. He was not safe yet. He was simply no longer alone. The approaching Allied fleet adjusted course as they detected both his ship and the damaged flagship behind him, quickly assessing the situation with the kind of swift, decisive coordination that suggested experienced commanders rather than confused, uncertain responders. Cale guided his battered vessel directly toward the approaching formation, watching on his display as the remaining hostile ships, still scattered from their earlier struggle through the asteroid corridor, began adjusting their own trajectories. Some pulled back immediately upon recognizing the newly arrived Allied presence, unwilling to risk direct confrontation against a properly organized defensive fleet. Others hesitated, clearly receiving conflicting orders from a command structure now dealing with a severely damaged flagship. The damaged flagship itself attempted to reverse course, engines straining visibly even from this distance as it tried to retreat back through the same corridor it had originally pursued Cale through. But the Allied formation moved to intercept, cutting off the most direct escape routes with practiced efficiency. Cale watched, equal parts exhausted and stunned, as the confrontation unfolded across his sensor display. This was no longer his fight alone. The Allied fleet engaged the remaining hostile ships directly, their coordinated formation overwhelming the scattered, disorganized remnants of what had once been a confident, patient pursuit force. His own ship, battered and barely holding together after hours of desperate maneuvering, continued limping toward the safety of Allied space, engines groaning with every remaining bit of effort they had left to give. A voice crackled through his comm system, clearer than any transmission he had managed to receive throughout the entire desperate chase. Unidentified vessel. This is Commander Owen Blake of the Allied Border Fleet. You are cleared to proceed toward our formation. Medical and engineering support standing by. Cale let out a shaky, relieved laugh, adrenaline finally beginning to fade now that immediate danger no longer pressed against every single decision he made. "Copy that, Commander," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "Trust me, I will take all the support you can offer." He guided his battered ship carefully toward the Allied formation, watching as the confrontation behind him gradually shifted decisively in favor of the newly arrived fleet. Several hostile vessels retreated entirely, abandoning the engagement rather than risk further losses. The damaged flagship, unable to outrun pursuit given its earlier injuries, eventually powered down its weapons systems entirely, apparently choosing surrender over further pointless conflict. Cale watched it all unfold with a strange, detached sense of disbelief. Hours earlier, he had been simply trying to survive a routine training flight gone wrong. Now, an entire hostile scouting fleet lay defeated or scattered behind him, and a garrison world that had no idea it stood in danger remained safe, at least for now, thanks entirely to a series of desperate improvisations aboard a ship everyone had expected to fail. As his vessel finally crossed fully into Allied territory, escorted closely by several formation ships, Cale allowed himself, for the first time in hours, to simply breathe. Whatever happened next, whatever explanations or consequences awaited him upon returning to the Academy, he understood with quiet, exhausted certainty that this was no longer simply a story about a broken ship and a failed cadet. This was something else entirely now. And he suspected, somewhere deep beneath his exhaustion, that everyone back home was about to learn exactly what that meant. The docking bay fell completely silent the moment Cale's battered ship settled onto the landing platform, hull scorched and trailing faint wisps of smoke from stress fractures along its outer plating. He sat motionless in the pilot's seat for several long seconds after the engines finally powered down, simply allowing himself to breathe without the weight of immediate danger pressing against every decision. When he finally emerged from the cockpit, stepping carefully onto the platform below, he found nearly the entire Academy staff gathered nearby, watching with expressions ranging from disbelief to open astonishment. Instructor Vesic stood at the front of the gathered crowd, pale blue features unreadable as always, though something in the alien's posture suggested genuine surprise rather than the usual calm indifference Cale had grown accustomed to. "Cadet Reyes," Vesic said slowly, gaze shifting between Cale and the damaged vessel behind him. "Reports indicate you engaged and effectively neutralized a hostile scouting fleet along the border region." "I wouldn't say I engaged them exactly," Cale replied, exhaustion evident in his voice, despite the faint edge of dry humor beneath it. "More like I really didn't want them catching me, and things sort of escalated from there." A murmur passed through the gathered crowd, several instructors exchanging glances Cale could not fully interpret. Commander Owen Blake, who had accompanied him back from the border region, stepped forward, addressing Vesic directly. "The Allied garrison world along that border received advance warning through Cadet Reyes' distress signal," Blake explained. "Without that warning, our defensive fleet would not have arrived in time to intercept the hostile formation before it reached the planet's immediate vicinity." Vesic's expression shifted slightly, something Cale could not quite name settling across the alien's usually composed features. "You were given that vessel," Vesic said, gesturing toward the scorched, battered ship behind Cale, specifically because it was considered unfit for any meaningful assignment. "Yeah," Cale said simply, glancing back at the ship that had somehow carried him through everything. "I noticed." Over the following days, Cale found himself repeatedly summoned before various Academy officials and visiting dignitaries, each wanting a first-hand account of exactly what had happened along that isolated stretch of unclaimed space. He answered every question honestly, describing the malfunctioning navigation system, the desperate flight through hostile territory, the improvised use of failing equipment to slow his pursuers, and the outdated star charts that ultimately led the enemy flagship directly into a forgotten minefield. Most listeners reacted with a mixture of fascination and quiet unease, the same unease Cale had noticed earlier from Vesic. It was not simply admiration for surviving an unexpected crisis. It was something closer to genuine unsettlement at exactly how he had managed it. During one particular meeting, an older alien official named Director Ilara Finch, representing the wider Galactic Council overseeing Academy operations, studied Cale carefully across a long conference table. "Your species has been part of this community for a relatively short time," Director Finch said eventually, tone measured but curious. "Many of us have observed certain patterns in human behavior during moments of extreme pressure, patterns that differ significantly from typical responses among established member species." "Is that a compliment?" Cale asked, unable to fully keep the tiredness from his voice after days of repeated debriefings. "It is an observation," Finch replied simply. "Most species, when faced with an unwinnable direct confrontation, either retreat entirely or attempt some form of negotiated surrender. Humans, it seems, tend toward finding a third option nobody else considers." Cale thought back to everything that had happened during those desperate hours. The plasma venting trick, the scattered coolant canisters, the deliberate lure through an old, forgotten minefield. None of it had been part of any standard tactical manual he had studied at the Academy. All of it had come from instinct, improvisation, and a stubborn refusal to simply accept the situation as hopeless. "We don't really have a manual for giving up," he said eventually, offering a tired half-smile. "Guess that's just how we're built." Word of the incident spread quickly beyond the Academy itself, reaching various allied worlds and eventually drawing attention from military analysts across several species. Reports detailed how a single, poorly equipped cadet had managed to delay, damage, and ultimately contribute directly to the defeat of an entire hostile scouting fleet, using nothing more than an aging, malfunctioning training vessel and a series of increasingly improvised tactics. Some among the wider galactic community viewed the story with genuine admiration, recognizing the resourcefulness and quiet determination it represented. Others reacted with far more caution, quietly re-evaluating exactly how dangerous humans might become once properly equipped and trained, given what one cadet alone had accomplished using equipment everyone had expected to fail entirely. Cale became aware of this shifting perception gradually, through subtle changes in how other cadets and instructors treated him during the following weeks. The amusement and quiet pity that once greeted him during training exercises faded, replaced instead by something closer to wary respect. Alien cadets who previously ignored him now occasionally sought him out, curious about human tactical thinking in ways they had never bothered exploring before. Even Vesic's demeanor shifted slightly during subsequent training sessions, the alien instructor occasionally pausing to ask Cale's opinion on tactical scenarios rather than simply dismissing human perspectives outright. "Your species tends toward unconventional solutions," Vesic observed during one such session, reviewing a simulated combat scenario alongside several other cadets. "Solutions that traditional training often overlooks entirely." "Sometimes the traditional solution isn't available," Cale replied, recalling the malfunctioning ship, the hostile fleet, and the desperate improvisation that had carried him through it all. "Sometimes you just have to work with whatever you've actually got." Months later, Cale received official recognition from the Academy for his actions during the border incident, though he found the formal ceremony itself far less meaningful than the quieter shift he noticed in daily interactions across campus. Cadets from other species now approached training exercises with a newfound curiosity about human tactical instincts, occasionally requesting his input during joint exercises that previously excluded human perspectives almost entirely. During one such exercise, a young alien cadet named Petra Lindholm, recently transferred from a neighboring allied academy, approached Cale directly after a particularly challenging simulation. "They told us humans tend to improvise rather than follow established protocol," she said, studying him with open curiosity rather than the wary caution he still occasionally encountered from other cadets. Is that true? Cale considered the question carefully, thinking back to that desperate flight through unclaimed space, the malfunctioning ship, the improvised tactics born entirely from necessity rather than any formal training. I think, he said slowly, it's less about ignoring protocol and more about understanding that sometimes protocol just doesn't cover every situation. Sometimes you have to figure things out as you go. Petra nodded thoughtfully, clearly filing the observation away for future consideration. As weeks turned into months, Cale continued his training, eventually receiving a properly maintained vessel for subsequent assignments rather than another decommissioned wreck destined for scrap. Yet he found himself occasionally recalling that broken, struggling ship with something closer to gratitude than resentment. It had, despite every flaw and malfunction, carried him through an impossible situation, largely because he had refused to simply accept its limitations as absolute. During a private conversation with Commander Blake sometime later, Cale found himself reflecting on everything that had happened since that initial, disastrous training flight. You know, Blake said, studying Cale thoughtfully across a quiet corner of the officers' mess hall. Most cadets given that particular vessel would have either failed the assignment outright or requested an immediate return once the malfunctions became apparent. I considered it, Cale admitted honestly, for about 30 seconds, right after the navigation system completely lost its mind. What stopped you? Cale thought about the question seriously before answering, recalling every instructor's dismissive glance, every quiet assumption from other cadets that humans simply were not built for genuine tactical brilliance, every subtle suggestion that his species remained fundamentally unproven within this wider galactic community. I guess, he said eventually, I just didn't want to give anyone the satisfaction of being right about us. Blake studied him for a long moment before offering a small, genuine smile. For what it's worth, the commander said, I don't think anyone doubts your species' capabilities anymore. Not after this. Cale nodded slowly, allowing himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction, despite the exhaustion and lingering unease still occasionally surfacing whenever he recalled those desperate hours navigating hostile space in a ship barely holding itself together. He understood, with quiet clarity, that this single incident had shifted something fundamental in how humanity was perceived across the wider galactic community, not through grand displays of strength or overwhelming technological superiority, but through simple, stubborn resourcefulness under impossible circumstances. Somewhere across countless allied worlds, military analysts and tactical instructors continued studying the incident carefully, recalibrating their understanding of exactly what humans might become capable of once given proper resources and training, rather than simply the broken, forgotten equipment everyone had originally assumed suitable for an unproven species. And somewhere deep within Cale himself, beneath the exhaustion and lingering uncertainty about everything still ahead, a quiet, stubborn confidence had settled permanently into place. He was no longer simply the only human cadet struggling to prove himself worthy of recognition among alien peers. He had become, whether he fully understood it yet or not, the reason an entire galactic community would think twice before ever underestimating humanity again.